Welcome back. Part 2 of Immaculate Deception. Welcome back. Part 2 of Immaculate Deception. And here we go. Pick up where we left off. She was beginning to tell us why women didn't have fear in the past and now they do, and she's blaming it on men. And the primitive, that's the next sentence. These primitive methods for inducing labor were the first attempt by humankind to improve upon the natural process. And improve is in quotes. Although it was not until many centuries later that such interferences would reach a level of sophistication. They did, however, open the way for the early priest-physician to move in on normal childbirth at the first sign of complication. In primitive times, this high official might have done nothing more than offer a prayerful chant to alleviate a woman's condition. But in more advanced societies, his counterparts introduced new practices of sanitation and hygiene that were to counteract many of the problems of crowded, quote-unquote, civilized conditions. As medical expertise about the complications in childbirth increased, physicians relegated the lowly art, quote-unquote, of normal birth care to the midwife, who by contrast had not changed her practice since the beginning of humankind. Normal, not sure what that, can't see that. To us, normal birth remained separate from sickness, disease, and disorder. Many ancient physicians attempted to pass on a basic knowledge of obstetrics to midwives. And it is recorded that even the father of medicine, Hippocrates, and the world's first obstetrician, Soranus, a Greek who brought advanced medical techniques to Rome, set up training courses and distributed written work specifically for midwives. But these efforts were largely ignored, as the midwife was not interested in medicine nor in treating complications of abnormal labor. Since she was required to call in the physician in all cases of abnormality, her major concern was only to improve the simple tools of her craft that she did use. It was the midwife, then, who devised the ancient birthing stool, a horseshoe-shaped chair with an open seat through which the baby was delivered into the waiting hands of the midwife, as a means of assisting, not altering, the natural process. I'd love to know where she's getting this information and whether it's urban myth or if there's evidence for what she's saying. I'm curious. Because midwifery was practiced solely by women, and because few other occupations were available for women, the midwife organized with other midwives and guarded her domain zealously. Her clannishness, her reluctance to educate herself under the guidance of physicians, and her grudging acceptance of rigid sanitary restrictions, made the midwife appear ignorant and unclean to the men of her culture. And I'm sure in different cultures through different times there's all kinds of stories, but this is different than what I recall. I recall that the medical obstetricians not that long ago, maybe 100 years-ish, maybe 150 years-ish ago, they were not, they didn't believe in the germ theory, and that they were causing maternal death due to infection because they weren't washing their hands before helping with the labor. And they were giving infections to the women, and that there was a study showing that if you washed your hands, you could lower the death rate of the women. And a lot of the doctors were adamantly against and opposed to washing their hands, and it was this debacle that happened for a certain number of years until finally it became standard of practice that the doctors had to wash their hands. So this is weird that she's saying that the midwives didn't want to wash their hands. So let's see where she's going with this. At the same time, however, excuse me, she was invaluable to women, not only as the sole attendant of normal birth, but also as advisor in matters of sex, children, abortion, contraception, and herbal cures. Although among ancient societies the science of medicine reached its zenith with the Greeks, the midwife and birthing mother continued to share a secretive relationship that preserved the mystery and wonder of birth. A secretive relationship. Not sure how it was secretive. And since normal processes of the body were exalted to the level of godliness in the Greek and Roman civilizations, woman's instinctual knowledge of birth, with all its creative, destructive power, remained intact. It was a peculiar combination of circumstances then, beginning with the advent of Christianity, that initiated a 2,000-year development of the modern deception most Americans believe today. So that was what the doula was telling me the other day, was that it was all Christianity's fault that women had so much pain in birth today, and well, they had so much fear. So this, perhaps she got it from this book. So this is fascinating. Let's see how she blames it on Christianity. That normal childbirth is... Let me try to fix this just a minute. I don't know that I can. That normal childbirth is benign. Sorry. Okay, sorry, I flipped the wrong page. So the last thing we said was that normal childbirth is inherently dangerous, risky, painful, and terrifying. I've got some strange setting here that's messed up my cursor. How do I... Maybe I'll restart this page. It was a peculiar combination of circumstances then, beginning with the advent of Christianity, that initiated a 2,000-year development of the modern deception most Americans believe today, that normal childbirth is inherently dangerous, risky, painful, and terrifying. For with the passage of one era to the next, and with the development of new laws, new morals, and a new religion, everything changed for woman in Western civilization. it came to be believed that Eve ate of the apple out of original sin, causing the banishment of humankind from paradise. But isn't that in the Hebrew scriptures, and wasn't that around for 1,000 years or 500 years before Christianity? Not sure why she's blaming that on Christianity, unless she's just saying that Christianity popularized it, or maybe they misinterpreted it or changed the original meaning. Let's see what she says. Eve ate of the apple out of original sin, causing the banishment of humankind from paradise. Man was consigned to a life of toil, but woman was to be punished forevermore by her own body. The Bible warned, again, this is Hebrew scriptures, not the Christian Bible. I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Therefore are my loins filled with pain, pangs have taken hold upon me, as the pangs of a woman that travelleth. They shall be in pain as a woman that travelleth. Travaileth. I don't know what that means. And upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. So she's saying, we'll see what she says, but these passages in the Bible then caused women to believe that childbirth was inherently dangerous, risky, painful, and terrifying. My guess is that it already was thought to be those things, and that whoever wrote the Bible was simply observing what seemed to be true already, and was just writing down what they already knew was true. I doubt that women were happy-go-lucky about it, and then the Bible came in and said, oh, no, women, you can't be relaxed and calm during your birth because God said you have to have pain. And then suddenly the women had pain. It doesn't make any sense. That the women were having pain and they were feeling it was dangerous and risky and terrifying first, and then the Bible came in and tried to explain why are women like that, and because God did it. That's like saying, well, because the Bible said that God created humans, then that's why humans now exist. Well, no, humans existed, and the Bible was trying to explain why we exist, so they said, well, because God did it. Anyway, let's see how she goes on from here. By placing a curse on woman's childbearing ability, early Christianity laid a solid foundation for Western civilization's attitude toward women. From that time on, man saw his partner as less than equal, shamed, sinful, and debased, and the proof of her degraded position was childbirth. Now the creative, destructive nature of woman's built-in fertility was split into the opposing forces of good or evil. Life on earth was branded a vale of tears, a wicked world of great pain and suffering. Woman, gateway to this world, could only be despised. Tertullian, one of the church fathers, wrote to woman, "The sentence of God on this sex of yours lives in this age. You are the devil's gateway. You destroy God's image, man." Sure. So I would say that church father, just looking at this out of context, she's not giving us the context in which he's saying this, and whether he's implying metaphor or literalism. But sure, that person who was in the church was promoting an agenda. That's different than the Bible. Whoever wrote the Bible wrote down some things, and that caused women to have problems in childbirth. Again, it's like blaming a gun for murder. Well, no, the person pulling the trigger is to blame, not the gun. Sure, the gun's the tool, but all tools can be used for good or bad. It doesn't mean that the tool is bad or that we need to get rid of all of those tools. I could kill someone with a knife, but should we get rid of the knives, or is it the knife's fault? Or is it the person who invented the knife? Is it that person's fault? So let's see how she goes on from here. So it's like these things are true. Like, oh, if a person hadn't invented a knife, then that person wouldn't have died from a knife stab. And that's all true, but people confuse truth with cause and effect. Well, cause and effect and intention. So if knives weren't invented, then I would kill the person with something else, like hit him on the head with a rock. So it's not going to prevent the murder. It's just going to change the method or the mode of the how the murder takes place. It's I think childish, unsophisticated thinking, but it's rampant today. Oh, white men controlled the government during slavery, therefore all white people are racist. It's bad logic. Okay. As a wife, she was humbled, and as a mother, she was... Oops, sorry. That woman was inherently evil could be seen by the monthly appearance of menstrual blood and by the pain, fear, and blood of birth. To be good, she had to renounce her body entirely and follow the chaste and spiritual path of the Virgin Mary. Her choice was to lead a life of ascetic devotion as a nun, or a life of service to her husband, as St. Paul wrote in the first epistle to Timothy. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried careth for the things of the Lord, and she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. That may be taken out of context, but certainly there are cultures around the world. The Western culture has lots of things that currently are looked down upon and that wouldn't work today, and in retrospect were a bad idea. But what is the cause? What is the cause of bad things that happen in cultures around the world? Nobody's really getting to the bottom of it, and they're blaming surface issues, which stops the hunt for the real cause. It's like, OJ was innocent, so it's all settled. Well, no. Who was the real murderer of Anna Nicole Smith? Anyway, as a wife she was humbled, and as a mother she was shamed. Tertullian wrote of the bitter, bitter pleasure of children, and asked, why should we be eager to bear children, whom, when we have them, we desire to send before us in glory, desirous as we are ourselves to be taken out of this most wicked world and received into the Lord's presence. The beginning of Christian civilization produced other changes that were to affect women in childbirth. earlier forms of education, medicine, and science that had reached an advanced state with the Greeks and Romans were buried in monasteries and regarded as forms of heresy. Now, man abandoned his power to reason and replaced it with religious faith. Disease was the work of the devil, and the power to cure it resided in God alone. Birthing mothers passively accepted their plight. Midwives, forgetful of simple hygiene and practicing what was by then a truly degraded profession, carried unwashed birthing stools from house to house and spread innumerable infections among women. Both women and men lost much of their health in the crowded, unsanitary, putrefying cities of Europe, and birth became the harbinger of pain, sickness, and danger. But it's kind of like the pandemic today. The great majority of people who die from coronavirus are already sick. They're chronically ill. They're obese, which causes body-wide inflammation, which is an immune system problem. People who have autoimmune diseases like diabetes, and people who already have cardiovascular disease or cancer and are already undergoing medical treatments. These are the people who are the most susceptible to microbes, including viruses, and yet no one's looking for the actual underlying cause. Well, there are people, but mainstream's not for some reason, which is let's get back as close as we can to the environment in which we evolved to be healthy, which is whole food diet, avoid junk food, avoid stress, learn how to have stress relief, and so forth. Lots of sunshine. And we're ignoring that. So I would say the real cause of the pandemic is unhealthy lifestyle. People who are thin and healthy, generally 90% of the time, are not going to die from the virus compared to sick people. So I would say the same was true back then, that the only reason these diseases were being spread by the midwives, if that's true, is not simply because they refused to wash their hands and wash the stools, but it's because the number of bacteria was so high because of everybody being sick in the first place. They were poor, first of all, and their diets were likely not well balanced. I think they still likely didn't understand fully rotating crops. Their crops may have been under nutritious, and perhaps even at times they had to eat a single source of food for months at a time because of poor farming practices. And of course, poor sanitation. They didn't have good sewer systems and that sort of thing. So I would blame a lack of technology as much or more than the failure to wash, which was likely also true with the doctors 100 years ago in the hospitals, that if the women had been healthier and the doctors were healthier, that they would be much less likely to spread infection even if they didn't wash their hands. Of course, we should do both, right? We should wash our hands and clean things and be healthy, do things to be healthy. So women lost their intuitive, Both women and men lost much of their health in the crowded, unsanitary, putrefying cities of Europe, and birth became the harbinger of pain, sickness, and danger. So woman lost her intuitive knowledge of childbirth and replaced it with fearful expectations of torturous agony. How could a body so cursed, so inherently evil, possibly give birth in the matter-of-fact manner of primitive woman? How could a husband, seeing his wife screaming in pain, attempt to help her when they both believed it was God's will that she must suffer in childbirth. Only the midwife remained something of a constant figure throughout this violent upheaval in the patterns of childbirth, as her soothing presence and constant attention at least provided sympathetic support throughout woman's travail. But it was not long before the midwife's role changed drastically, too, especially when the barber surgeon, acting in the name of God to save unborn souls, moved in on normal childbirth at the first sign of complications. Since it was heresy for even the barber surgeon to expose his eyes to woman's private parts, he was required to tie a sheet around his neck and extend it to the woman's neck to obscure his view and leave his hands free to work. Since lengthy or difficult labor might indicate that the baby would die before delivery, he was required to insert a syringe filled with holy water up through the birth canal to baptize the fetus. If the infant was within reach, he, or following his instructions, the midwife, pulled out whatever part could be grasped, usually a leg or an arm, and cut it off with a crude saw. Each part was doused with holy water until as many parts were pulled out and hacked off as possible, by which time, of course, both child and mother had probably died. Never heard that before. I'm guessing that was a rare occurrence. For the most part, however, normal birth remained with the midwives, primarily because the care of women at birth was thought to be beneath men, and physicians who attended normal births were sharply criticized as potential heretics. Midwives retained their close and helpful relationship as advisors to women, and in silent and secretive defiance of the Church's strictest doctrine, practiced abortion. The confusion between witches and midwives was a simple one. Both were condemned by the Church for practicing arts involving sex and reproduction. Anyone who performed abortion or attempted by mysterious herbal concoctions to alleviate woman's pain in birth was easily branded witch and condemned to death at the stake. I just don't think that people were that stupid. I think that women would have passed down the knowledge of which herbs, which weeds to go gather in the forest and make tea out of them for their needs. They wouldn't need a midwife to do that for them. So most likely this was in the city. Maybe it was, just seems like city folk typically are less in touch with nature, and they would typically lose the oral tradition of different folk remedies. And so there would be an opportunity for a midwife to have a job in the city, because she, coming from the farms, would know all of the information, and then she would charge people a fee to give them the remedies that they had forgotten in the cities. And so, of course, when there's lots of people in a small area, it's much easier to police, to have rules and to police people. And so I'm guessing this was more of a problem in the big cities, and probably not really a problem in the rural farming areas, which was likely most of the world. But what do I know? And she's not giving references, so I'm taking everything she's saying about the history of it with a grain of salt. I know it was bad, things were bad, but a lot of it was simply a loss of our natural environment in which we evolved, which made us sick, and then we didn't have the technology to help us to be healthy despite not being in our natural environment. And 12,000 years since we started farming, the history of mankind has been horrible because we've been sick, and because we hadn't figured out how to stay healthy outside of our African environment in which we evolved in nature. And I would say that we're still at the tail end of that, and we still are, even though we know it, we're refusing to accept the fact that we need to pay more attention and fix our environment instead of hacking our way out of it with pharmaceutical drugs. So let's see. Actually, the cult of witchcraft was an unholy or debased form of pagan fertility religions and celebration of the body. The witch was the black sister of the Virgin Mary, the other half of the female persona, and fertility goddess of primitive times, now distorted to fit the neglected physical needs of Christianized woman. Through witchcraft, women attempted to regain the power of fertility she had lost. Witchcraft permitted woman to accept, even exalt, her body and her senses, and it was a powerful medicine for a repressed and shamed society. In Christian man's attempt to exorcise the devil from his midst and pave his way to heaven, he found the witch, and by association the midwife, an easy victim. The midwife's secret and intimate relationship to birthing woman often seemed to provide strength and courage for woman in her travail when she should have been suffering the pain of her God-given condition. And the supposed needs of witchcraft seemed to conform to the duties of the midwife. As William Blatty explains in the popular novel The Exorcist, "Well, I really don't know about ritual murder," said Carus. "I don't, but a midwife in Switzerland once confessed to the murder of 30 or 40 babies for use at Black Mass." "Oh well, maybe she was tortured," he amended. "Who knows? But she certainly told a convincing story. She said she'd hide a long, thin needle up her sleeve so that when she was delivering the baby, she'd slip out the needle and stick it through the crown of the baby's head and then hide the needle again. No marks," he said, glancing at Kinderman. "The baby looked stillborn. You've heard of the prejudice European Catholics used to have against midwives. Well, that's how it started." I'm not sure that would kill a baby quickly. And maybe if she injected a poison, but just sticking a needle in their brain, pretty sure they would live for a few days at least. Anyway, fear of the midwife as witch existed outside continental Europe as well. In 1591, a Scottish midwife, Agnes Sampson, was burned as a witch on a hill in Edinburgh for merely attempting to relieve the pain of the woman she was attending in labor. The strange death of Anne my mouse is messed up again. Through witchcraft, women attempted to regain the power of fertility she had lost. Oh, I just read that. Okay, so I see. The strange death of Anne Hutchinson, a colonial American midwife who was excommunicated and banished from her home in Massachusetts, also shows the confusion of midwife and witch after resettling in Long Island. She was denounced for her outspoken views by the governor of the colony and was eventually scalped in an Indian raid. One version of this story, equally likely, states that she was tarred, feathered, and scalped by the men of her community who suspected her of witchcraft. As the deception of the midwife as witch gradually took hold, so woman's place next to man, her wondrous position as life-giver, and her responsibility in the process of childbirth gradually lost hold. Generation after generation and century after century, women increasingly believed that childbirth was inherently dangerous, risky, painful, and terrifying, and that her body was to blame. Had nothing else happened to childbirth, it is probable that modern woman would still bear the scars of this awesome and awful period of degradation, debasement, and shame. But as if to implant the fear of childbirth in Western women for all time, a final punishment for the curse upon her sex was yet to come. The spread of pestilence and disease in European cities took such a heavy toll that the sick and starving could be seen dying in the street. As a means of saving souls rather than treating the ill, the church gathered the sick together in charity hospitals. Sufferers of syphilis, gonorrhea, yellow fever, cholera, smallpox, malaria, tuberculosis, plague, leprosy, typhoid, diphtheria, dysentery, typhus, and other diseases were placed side by side in the same beds as doctors, priests, and nuns alike were unaware of the dangers of infection or the safeguards of sanitation. Howard Haggard, MD, in Devils, Drugs, and Doctors, 1929, quotes a description of a typical scene at one of these hospitals. In one bed of moderate width lay 4, 5, or 6 persons beside each other, the feet of one of the head of another, children beside gray-haired old men. In the same bed lay individuals affected with infections, diseases, beside others only slightly unwell. On the same couch, body against body, a woman groaned in the pangs of labor. A nursing infant writhed in convulsions. A typhus patient burned in the delirium of fever, and a victim of some disease of the skin tore with furious nails his infernally itching integument, which means skin. The whole building fairly swarmed with the most horrible vermin like rats, I guess, and the air of a morning was so vile in the sick wards that the attendants did not venture to enter them without a sponge saturated with vinegar held before their faces. The bodies of the dead ordinarily lay 24 hours and often longer upon the deathbed before they were removed, and the sick were compelled to share the bed with the rigid corpse, which in this infernal atmosphere soon began to stink, and over which the green carrion flies swarmed. I'm guessing this might have been the exception, not the rule, throughout history. I don't know. We tend to characterize the past, and we tend to think that the worst case scenarios that did happen were the norm. But it is horrible. But it's a combination of ignorance and a lack of our natural environment. Most of those diseases were caused by vitamin D deficiency combined with nutritional deficiency. So the first hospitals were not only centers of disease and disorder, but disseminators of infection, and the effect on laboring woman was catastrophic. For many centuries, woman lived with the fear that even if she survived the terrible agony of birth, a mysterious disease known as childbed fever might overtake her body, a few days later causing delirium, high fever, convulsions, and death. Occurrences of this sickness were at first comparatively infrequent, but as soon as women were herded into lying in hospitals to give birth, the disease spread to epidemic proportions, sometimes killing entire wards of new mothers. You know, a semblance of this is happening today. The number 3 cause of death, multiple studies have shown that when they look at the cause of death data, that the number 3 cause of death is medical mistakes. And that includes the doctor doing everything correct according to the medical standard, but the patient has an unusual reaction to the normal dose of the normal medication. So both mistakes where the doctor gives the wrong medication or the nurse gives the wrong medication, and also just nobody made a mistake, it's just that drugs are dangerous. So I don't know if it's true. There's a urban myth, at least, that when that there's a study that when the garbage collectors go on strike, that diseases go up and the death rate goes up because there's garbage on the street. And when doctors go on strike, the death rate goes down because the medical mistakes, the cause of death from medical mistakes goes away during that time frame, which I don't know if that's true, but it's a funny and interesting analogy or story to demonstrate that this has been going on for a long time, obviously, that going to the hospital can sometimes be more dangerous than staying home. Of course, the opposite is also true, especially today. Women were so terrified of the disease they would do almost anything to avoid entering a hospital for birth. Sound familiar? Sound like coronavirus? Hospitals were empty last year, right? During the pandemic, because people were so afraid of catching coronavirus that they'd be having mild heart attacks and they would still not go to the hospital. But the poor often had no choice. Physicians of all kinds, students, barbers, butchers, and in some areas shepherds and hog gelders, worked on women in labor as part of their medical training. Often they would arrive with their hands still bloody from dissecting cadavers of diseased patients, and would then insert their hands far up into the birth canals of laboring women, infecting one and all with the germs that remained on their unwashed skin. You know, it's a really bad idea to insert your hand up the birth canal, even if you're washing. So it's not just that they weren't washing, it's that, well, why were they putting their hand up there in the first place? So the doctor, quote unquote, himself, sporting a bloodied apron as a badge of his profession, became the carrier of the very disease he was supposed to cure. And childbed fever became the scourge of Europe for more than 2 centuries. If woman had anything left of the matter-of-fact sensibilities in birth of her primitive ancestor, she was now consumed with abject terror. I'm missing something, though, because in her original story there was a midwife who helped her in the made up story of primitive woman having birth in her hut on the bed with moss on it. And I'm not convinced that there were such things as midwives until more relatively recently. That I think that every mother and every woman was a midwife. That when a woman had a baby, her sisters and her mother and her aunt and her grandmother all helped out. And so all women were midwives. It's like they didn't have chefs come in and cook their food for them. And because they never cooked food, therefore the women forgot how to cook food, and then they started to become afraid of cooking food because superstitions developed around it, and men told them that only a cook can touch food, or else the devil will get you, and this sort of thing. I mean, I guess eating food, you eat the food, so that won't help you know how to cook it. But it just seems to me that, especially since people have been so poor throughout history, that the women themselves originally were the midwives, just like they were the chefs. And so there's something else going on that women have, because I agree, women have lost their ability to tune in with their natural instincts and to realize that childbirth is, even though it is a little bit scary and it is painful, that it's a normal, natural process, and that it's not something to be overly anxious and obsessed over, and that you should have to require having all kinds of technology in order to help you birth your baby, except in rare circumstances. So something else, I don't know, I guess she's saying that not only the fact that they were persecuting midwives, herbal remedies, but that the church was telling the men that they were in charge of their wives, and they were telling women that they were inherently evil. So I would say so there was an oppression of women by today's standards, for sure, and that's why so all of that combined is why they lost their ability to help each other out. Did I miss the part? Did they say that you had to go to the doctor? Because she's saying that women were afraid to give birth without going to the doctor. But I'm missing the exact connection between all of these things, all these causative agents, and women losing their confidence completely. I mean, childbirth is something like, it's a natural, even Ina May Gaskin, the famous midwife from Tennessee, she said that giving birth is a similar process as having a bowel movement. And so I guess you do have to potty train your children, but you don't have to train them how to let the stool come out. It just comes out. And so let's think about this. If there was a whole bunch of religious nonsense around bowel movements being evil, and if there was let's say men didn't have bowel movements, it just somehow magically came out in their urine or their lungs or something, and so only women had bowel movements, and so it was bowel movements for women was a curse by God. Would it be possible to, over time, cause women to fear their bowel movements and to need to go to the doctor every day in order for the doctor to help them get their stool out? Because potentially, especially if you have a bad diet and your stool is hard, and if your bowel is distended, and like, it can hurt, there can be blood, there can be hemorrhoids and blood when you have a bowel movement. I was constipated as a child, and it was a scary, horrible thing, because I couldn't figure out how to get the stool out, and my parents were very concerned, and that made it worse. So I guess so. I guess when you have the people around you being afraid of your natural body processes, they will infect you with a paranoia that will become real to you, because that's kind of what happened with me a bit. Now, of course, the cause of my constipation was a mixture of a diet that was not good for me specifically, together with a diet that wasn't optimum for any human, because it had processed foods that weren't around when we evolved. But I was particularly sensitive to them, combined with potentially my personality. So I've been told by my acupuncturist that when things didn't go my way, or I didn't get what I needed, I would think too much about it, and thinking too much can often slow the body's natural processes, slow the bowel down. I don't know if that's true, but it's reasonable. But what if I had a natural diet? What if I had a good diet, but my parents had been 10 times as paranoid about me having bowel movements? Would it still have been difficult for me to have bowel movements? Would it still have been problematic? I don't know. And so with the childbirth and women being terrified, and I guess she hasn't gotten yet to the other parts, which are that if a woman is terrified of the birth process, then that slows down the labor, which then causes the doctor to want to intervene and do a C-section. And so it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy that you're afraid that there's going to be problems, so then there is a problem and you have to have intervention, and that the underlying cause of that is the woman being terrified. And the underlying cause of that, according to this book, is society. So the culture has been messed up, for sure. So I agree with this. Overall, I agree. Maybe not all the specific details. I think it's very complicated and complex. But certainly our culture has gotten messed up to the point where it's actually interfering with our natural bodily processes. Wild. I don't see that she's gotten to the underlying cause of why have our cultures gotten so messed up. Of course, she might just say, well, it's only the white Western culture, and that in this instance may or may not be true. But I would say that all cultures are messed up to some degree, and perhaps the further from nature they've gotten, the more messed up they are, I might, as a general rule, say. All right, so that's all for today, and we'll see you next time.
A picture of him.
I will.
Yeah, you should like Goldfinger.